So without further ado, I want to hand over the program to the San Jose Printers Guild, which is a volunteer organization of letterpress printers who staff the History San Jose Museum print shop at History Park. And they wanted to show us around. So Jim Gard, our longtime member of the organization, will be our guide. Hi, Jim.
Hello. Welcome to History Park in San Jose, California. I'm Jim Gard. I'm part of the San Jose Printers Guild, and this is our printing office here on the grounds of History Park. Let's go inside and take a look at the exhibit, and then we'll do some printing. Come on in. In the front room of our little print shop exhibit, we have an exhibit space set up with a little history of the milestones in typesetting. The first thing we're going to look at is before there was movable type, there was carving, and they carved in wood. I have a few examples in here of some illustrations that were used way back in the day. This last one on the right here that he's showing you now is Lick Observatory. That's a copy of a wood engraving. They did beautiful work with very fine detail on the end grain of carved wooden blocks. Coming around to the next side of our cabinet, our next milestone in typesetting. Back in the middle of the 1400s, Gutenberg invents movable type. Now, I'd spend a lot more time in this cabinet talking about the composing stick and the individual letters that are in there, but we're going to show that to you live in just a moment in the next room. The next milestone in typesetting involves the linotype machine. We have a few artifacts on display in here. There's some linotype slugs. There are some matrices, the little brass molds that form the letters on the edge of those slugs. There's a mold taken from the machine itself. And in that mold is a slug, and I put some of the matrices on the face of the mold to show where they would be positioned inside the machine. Now, all that's all well and good, except looking at those components, it's really hard to tell how that would come together. So we have a 2/3 size picture of a Linotype Model 5. And here's its keyboard. But before we use this keyboard, we're going to look at a practice keyboard. This is the keyboard that the Linotype operators would learn to use before they would actually operate a linotype machine. It's not laid out like the keyboard on your computer. It's a better arrangement for the efficiency of use, and it spells out ETAOINSHRDLU, and we just call that an Etowah Shirley keyboard. Now back to our big picture. The linotype machine keyboard you just saw is down here in the picture. When you press these keys, it releases those little brass matrices from this magazine. They slide down through these veins behind this cover, and they're put together here on what's called the assembly elevator. Once the operator has completed a line of letters in that assembly elevator, they push a big lever on the right side of the keyboard and it raises up. The letters slide across onto what's called the first elevator, and it drops down in for casting. The machine has on the back, we can't see it here, but there are these enormous cams, and the cams operate all the different functions of the machine. And they bring a melting pot forward full of molten metal, and it injects the mold with the molten metal and forms the slug with the matrices casting the letters on the edge of that slug. They pop out in this little tray right here, and actually ready to print at that point. They can go directly from that tray into the printing press. Now, we would love to show this big machine, but it weighs over 3,000 pounds, and the little building I'm standing in wouldn't hold it up. So we hope someday, with funding, to build a new building next door, because we have artifacts like this one. Actually, we have 2 of these waiting across the street to go on display someday. Now, moving on to the next phase of the milestones in typesetting, this is one that all of you will be familiar with, and that's when the computers come in. In the 1980s, it all changes. This is a Macintosh. It's actually a very late model Macintosh. But paired up with a laser printer, you could start doing typesetting in your own home with more typefaces and styles and sizes than even the best of linotype shops would have had.
We have a question, Jim.
Fantastic. Do tell, Monica.
Well, people are curious how we came about having a print shop at History San Jose. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about how that happened and how we were able to get these wonderful artifacts that you're showcasing?
Absolutely. So way back in the day, in the 1970s, some gentlemen wanted to, well, put together a history park with buildings and have living history. And those gentlemen, who included Theron Fox and Leonard McKay, and someone might recognize Leonard McKay's name because there used to be Smith and McKay printing in downtown San Jose. Well, those gentlemen were printers, and they decided if they were going to have an exhibit on the History Park grounds, the first exhibit to open would be a print shop. So this little building, which was once someone's house in downtown San Jose, was brought to the museum grounds in the 1970s. The printing press you're going to see later was actually acquired in 1963. So they had a press ready to go, and then Leonard McKay at his shop downtown had additional equipment available. So those all came together into this building to become the print shop as we know it today. It opened in 1973, and I came along and started volunteering here, a year or two later, about 1975.
Thanks so much for telling us all that.
Well, thank you for the question. That was an excellent question, and I'm glad we got to cover that. Now we're going to go in and see some real activity in the shop, because this is just an exhibit space up front here. Lots of detail on the walls we can't get into in the hour program, but let's go into the next room and do some typesetting.
Hello.
This is Katie. She's one of our Printers Guild members, and she has agreed to help us today with some typesetting demonstration.
Yeah, so we're going to set some type. I'm holding a composing stick, which is what we use to hold the type while we're setting it. And we have some nice, big, slimy, bold type for you guys to be able to see on the camera today. So all the letters have their own space in this case. I'm using a California job case, which is the standard layout of the letters. So once you memorize this, you can get going real quickly setting the words that you are trying to set.
So as Katie sets this, I'm going to jump in and do a little play-by-play, make it a little easier for her to set, not try to talk and set at the same time. The letters are all a mirror image of what they'll print. So not only does she need to know the layout of the typecase, she also needs to recognize the characters to make sure they're the right ones by recognizing their mirror image. She still reads left to right. So it's kind of upside down, but it's still left to right reading, the mirror image of each character. A little more about that typecase, by the way. Originally, they kept the letters in two separate typecases. This case up above here is where they put the capital letters, and the little letters, or just letters, went in the case below it. To this day, you refer to those as uppercase letters and lowercase letters. And that's where they get their names. Oh, looks like Katie's finished her line.
Yeah. So once you finish setting your type, you're ready to print it, or get it ready to print, you're going to take it over to the composing stone and get it locked up in a case.
Which I have left locked up here. So the stone, as it was called, was staffed by a person they called the Stone Man. And that was where these lines would come over, whether they were linotype slugs from a linotype machine or individual letters from a stick. These would be slid out onto the stone. Now those are all loose there, but they would have the slugs put around them, and they would be joined together like this form here. You can see the metal letters that are in here. These are what are called the coins, spelled with a Q. They're metal wedges. And I'm actually disassembling this to show you how it was put together. So now you can see that this line here that says Printers Guild, those are individual letters as well. Spacing is put around them. They're positioned where you want to have them for the printing job. And then once you've got it where you want it, you would just cinch these up. Not too tight, but enough just to snug them up in here. That should do it. So getting them snug, and then a planer block is laid on top of the type, and that's knocking it down to the stone surface of the table. The table has been ground flat to make sure that when we do that, all of this ends up flat. You want the form to be perfectly flat because when it goes to print at the press, if one of the letters were higher than the others, it would punch through the paper. You've also damaged the letter. You'll notice as I do this, I'm laying my hand over the face of the type. It's a little safety tip because the steel key that I'm using to tighten the coins, if I were to slip and drop it on the type, it would damage the letters. Once I've tightened up the form, I lift it up by the corner and I push with my fingers on each of the letters to make sure that none of them are loose. As it turns out, if a letter were even slightly loose while it's printing on the press, that letter might work up. In fact, spacing material can do it as well. And occasionally in historic pieces of printing, you can see where a letter worked up and pushed into the paper very deeply. You can also see where spacing material worked up, and it actually makes kind of a rough, ragged line that doesn't belong in the printing. Printers recognize it, and they say, ooh, they had a work up. But the rest of the public would look at it and say, well, that's just an artifact of old printing. So we're all very careful about that when we do that. With that, I'm going to introduce you to another Katie, who's going to tell you a little bit about some of our presses.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie, and I am also with the San Jose Printers Guild. So the next thing we're going to do is look at some of the presses that we have here in the shop. If you've been to any of our events, if you've been to the Bay Area Printers Fair, which we hosted for several years, or you've seen us at Bay Area Book Arts Jam, you may have seen some of these presses with us and seen us printing on them there. This is probably the smallest press we have in the shop. It's a 3x5 Kelsey. It's relatively portable compared to some of the other equipment that we have, although you would be surprised by the number of presses we're actually able to take out and use outside of the shop, despite their size and their weight. So this is our smallest press. This one you can pick up, move around, and we can take this to a lot of different events. The size after that would be the 6x10 press that we have here. This is a pilot press. Again, this is another press. It's a tabletop press and also one that we would use out at different events here at History Park or throughout the community for different events that we hosted. We also have a couple of proof presses. This is a Poco proof press. And then here on the other side of the room, we have a Potter proof press. So both of these presses have actually been taken outside of the shop. We've used them at events. We've had them out on the porch or in the street here at History Park, and we printed large size posters on them. So that gives us a lot of versatility in what we're able to do when we're printing and when we're working and doing events with the community. So
one quick question, Katie.
Sure.
The portable one that the first one you showed us, how much does it weigh?
How much does it weigh?
Oh,
like 40, 45? I don't know. How much? Lift it up, Jim.
About maybe 20, 25 pounds.
Okay.
It's made of cast iron.
Yeah, so that would be our smallest, lightest press. So I would say about 25 pounds.
Actually, I have one that's a little smaller and a
Do
little
you
lighter.
have
Yes,
one
I
that's
do.
small? Well, I think that's the smallest one we have in the shop. There actually there are presses even smaller than that. They're sort of calling card size, I think, right?
Yes.
Sort of a parlor press. But this is the smallest one that we have here. The Pilot, on the other hand, weighs...
about 200 pounds.
Yeah, I was going to say 175.
Yeah.
I have a press like this, and I cannot move it on my own. It took 3 people to get it into my shop space. So this is definitely a heavier press. And then some of the other larger presses that we have, like the Potter press, this we had to use a forklift on to get out into the street. But we were able to move it, but it's a pretty substantial piece of machinery. But the one press that we never take out of the shop is our Liberty press. And this is a pretty unusual press. This isn't really like what you would see in most shops, and even for lots of people who are very familiar with printing and with letterpress, they might not be very familiar with this kind of press. So Jim, can you give us some more information about the Liberty?
Sure. So when those gentlemen I mentioned, Thorne Fox and company, were putting together the exhibit, they went all the way to a convent to get this press. There was a convent in downtown San Jose, the Notre Dame High School. It was a girls' school with the nuns in the full outfit. One of our former Printers Guild members from way back when was involved when they got that press and actually had to go into the cloistered environment, which at the time was a really interesting situation because they didn't allow men in at all, and yet he had to go in and show them how to learn how to use the press. Fast forward to about 1963, they had moved the entire arrangement to Belmont, California, and I believe it was Thorne Fox who went there and met with the head nun at the convent and said that they would like to take this as a donation. So the press was disassembled by movers. And by the way, if you're ever going to move a press, don't have movers disassemble it because when they did, they actually got some of the parts mixed up. But they brought it down to San Jose and they rebuilt it on this special concrete slab that had been cast specifically to support the machine. I learned later from the gentleman who made that slab just how big of a concrete slab it is. Because this printing press, we don't know exactly, but I put it somewhere in the 1,200 to 1,700 pounds range. It's heavy, but they weren't worried about the weight. The building could probably hold that. They were more worried about the motion of the machine, shaking the building and basically knocking the building apart, loosening up all the nails and everything. The concrete slab, by the way, goes through about 2 feet of crawl space and then 3 feet into the ground. So about 5 feet of concrete it's sitting on top of. But back to the printing part of all of this. This press was an odd design. It was sort of a first try. It's an idea where they would put the type in the bed, and this is the chase, just like you saw I was putting together on the stone. You can see the coins here and the columns of the type that were put together in it. We've got an ink plate up above and these 2 rollers. And I'm going to go ahead and show you a little bit about the inking because when people are here in person, one of the first things they ask at that point is, where does the ink come from? So today I have, for demonstration, this is a can of one of my favorite inks, the Van Swan ink that comes from Holland. And you dip your ink knife into the ink in the can, and you get a nice glop of it on the end there, and then you touch that to the ink plate and spread a little bit on there. You'll see printers do this all the time in shops right after they've handled a can of ink. You don't want to get ink on your fingers and start spreading it all around. This press, the one advantage to having the rollers in these funny slots on here is that you can now take the ink roller like a big rolling pin and roll it across and spread that ink out. That clankety clank you're hearing is a ratchet on the back of the ink plate. To keep the ink distribution even while the press is operating, each time it makes an impression, it rotates that plate a little bit. So now that we've added a little ink, I'm going to roll this back by hand, and you can see how the ink rollers roll across the face of the type. Now, with the assistance of my operator here, Katie's going to show how these letter presses were operated in the day. This is a treadle press. So down near the floor, Katie's got her foot on the treadle, her other foot firmly on the floor. She'll be picking up paper with the right hand and feeding it in. Now, there's already one in there, so when it starts, we're going to print one. And then she'll pull it out with her left hand.
So Jim, do you think that this press might have had a motor at some point?
Yes, absolutely. So in the early days of printing, when this press was invented about 1860, there weren't motors, but there were steam engines. So in big printing plants, they would have had a steam engine. They park that steam engine on the side. I don't mean like a steam engine that goes on rails, but a steam engine that would have a pulley system to a shaft that runs across the ceiling of the room. That would come down to a pulley on the press itself, and it would run this flywheel, and you wouldn't use the treadle, you'd set that aside. One of the old printers told me one time, in this stuff here, about a shop he worked in where they had a steam engine in the early days, but later on the steam engine wasn't working so well, and they needed to replace it. And they got a V8 out of an old Chevy. And they put that outside the building, and in the morning they'd start it up just like a car, and it would run the presses all day. And at the end of the day, they'd shut it off, just like a car. So yeah, printers would abandon the treadle if they could get a motor. A lot of hobby printers will get old presses like this, and they'll just put the motor behind the flywheel and run the belt around. In fact, in the press photo of this machine in 1963, you can see the motor and the belt that went around the flywheel.
Tammy has a question.
Yes, please.
So she wants to know if you could give her the name of this press again and the size of the platen.
Okay, I left that part out. That's a good question. So this is an F.M. Weiler Liberty press. And the F.M. Weiler Liberty Machine Works made these presses from about 1860 until about 1890 in Brooklyn, New York. So they made these about 30 years. A long run for the same type of equipment. The chase in this press has an inside dimension of 10 inches by 15 inches. So in the trade, this is just referred to as a 10 by 15 jobber. Chandler and Price made many of these in a different style than this, because this is the Liberty style. But there were a lot of these that were shipped overseas. And to this day, there are quite a few of them in Europe, and there are quite a few of them in the US. Mm-hmm. And there's a website.
Yeah, so if you're interested in learning more about the Liberty Press, one of our guild members actually has put a website together, and the address is handsetpress.org, handsetpress.org. And he has identified Liberty presses in Europe and in the US and in other parts of the world and given information about those particular presses. And he gives a lot of details. There's a lot more photos. So if you want to learn more about the Liberty Press, I really recommend checking out this website. It's super helpful.
Thank you. And I made sure to post that on our chat so people can go ahead and look that up.
So I'm going to tell you about the printing job that we're doing here today. And there's quite a backstory on why we're printing a label. And you may have seen this in the advertising for this event. This is a Libby's label. This is, oh, I need to be louder? Push it closer, okay. That's better. All right. So you'll notice this says Sunnyvale brand, and there's a hyphen in Sunnyvale. The Libby's plant was located in Sunnyvale, and it was there in the 1970s. I imagine they hyphenated Sunnyvale so that it wouldn't be confused with the city, or that they wouldn't have any conflict of interest there. But an interesting thing happened when the Sunnyvale plant was shut down. They had a print shop inside. It had a platen letterpress. It had typecases, just like Katie was setting from. And they typeset labels like this one, not so much for you in the grocery store. You would never have seen this in your local supermarket. These were for institutional use. They were meant to go on a number 10 can. I can pick this one up here and show you. That's what a number 10 can looks like. And anybody who's ever worked in a restaurant or a cafeteria, these are the standard size for volume, large volume things that you use in cafeterias, in the military, and in hospitals and hotels. So when they were going to do an export of these to another country, they would print a label that would identify the things, Libby's Cannery, and it had all the information, sometimes in foreign languages for where it was destined to go. They would set all these up with handset type, and they would add a logo like this one for the Libby's plant. This is kind of a fun thing. What happened in the 70s when they shut down, like a lot of big manufacturing plants, they sold off all the equipment, including the printing equipment. And it went to auction. And one of my neighbors, who was an inventor, was working with some friends of his, and they were making picture frames, plastic picture frames, which you put your photo in. Those bent plastic ones were very popular in the 70s. And they wanted to put the name of the picture frame company in the plastic. They wanted to hot stamp it. So they went to this auction. They saw this type and they thought, this is great. We can get all this old printing type and we'll use it to mark our picture frames. So they bought the whole lot. And it had a type case very similar to the one that Katie was working from, except without the compartments. And they brought it all home and they took the type and they heated it up in their hot stamp equipment and it melted. So sadly, the big lot of type they bought was never going to mark picture frames. I saw some of the experiments and they didn't look good. And they knew I was a printer. I was a hobbyist printer. I had a 10 by 15 press of my own. And they approached me and they said, we just got a whole lot of type. We don't want it. Would you like to have it? So they sold it to me, apparently pennies on the dollar, and I brought it all home, and it sat and sat and sat until years later, we were looking for a printing job to do here at the museum. We were often looking for jobs that would have something to do with the, or what did it call, the Valley of Heart's Delight, and getting all this food that was being produced in the valley and how it was being canned and whatnot, and this label was perfect for that. So we put it all together in a form. We actually printed it in 2 colors at that time with the red Libby's logo and the blue type around it, because this one was the best fit for that job. The sad story in that was that we went and tried to track down the man who had worked in the shop at the Libby's plant. And unfortunately, he passed away a few years before. And had I gone back at the day I got the type, we could have talked to him about it and found out how he'd done it. But every time they set one of these labels up, they never knew what they might need to use it again. And it's the case in our shop as well. We have galley after galley, that's the little metal tray where we save type, full of what are called standing forms. So he would tie up this type with string, he put it in neat little boxes, and he put it into this wooden cabinet they had custom built to save all of his type. So to this day, all of these forms are still standing. There's quite a few of them for maraschino cherries.
Wow.
And I can tell by the ink stain on it that the maraschino cherry labels were printed in red. This one had a little bit of blue ink on it, so I decided they must have printed this label in blue at one time. And the Libby's logo, I don't think they would have done it 2-color. The job was just to get it done and get it on the cans, and I'm told sometimes just on the boxes. So the cans in the box would not be labeled at all. They would just be 6 cans in a box, and it would say this on the outside of the box.
So a lot of those jobs are still already set, right, Jim? So
Yeah.
they're the way they were set years and years ago by the original printer in the shop, correct?
Right. This column over here on the right, and part that says Libby's in the Sunnyvale part, that is as it was set by the gentleman at the Libby's plant. We had to estimate because we didn't get to talk to him, but we think this was done probably in the 1950s or maybe some years before that. When you look at it on the press here, this column over here is exactly as it was set in the Libby's plant. I've actually made no changes to that at all. The Sunnyvale with the hyphen, this type here, as it was set. The only thing I've done is I've put this particular Libby's logo on top of it. We knew that he had a Libby's logo there. We just don't know what size it was. So I chose the one that seemed to fit the best, and that's how that came to be. The type on the left here, this was set here in our shop yesterday. So I picked a little dingbat for the top. That's what printers call the ornaments. And then I set all of that type below it. And I made the 3 columns that you see in the press.
So that's fascinating. If Libby's ever changed the design or the brand, would that mean they'd have to build a whole new typeset?
Well, in the case of just the logo changing, they would just replace this artwork part. So they would take the Libby's artwork, they would send it to a photo engraver, and they would transfer that artwork to a metal plate. Katie, could you grab one of those?
I'm going to grab one of these.
Steve, stay with me. So she's going to bring over, and I'm going to hold it up here next to it, and bring the whole arrangement.
Yeah, so I'm bringing over a galley, which is full of a lot of different Libby's logos, like Jim was talking about. And Jim, why don't you go ahead and...
I'm going to just set it down here.
Yeah, let's put it right here.
So this is actually, back in the day when we were doing this for the first time years ago, I brought 2 labels down. This is the maraschino cherries label. And you'll notice there's some wood blocks across the top here. And I found out later by going through all the Libby's logos, because these are used across different labels and they're expensive, they had a Libby's logo made up for the different sizes, and then they shared it amongst the different forms. And you can see by the size of this block that's put in here for spacing, that this Libby's logo would fit right over the top of the maraschino cherries. And there are smaller ones and larger ones. So I found this one to fit. You can see how that lines up with the Libby's logo right here. Now, the other thing I found is that in some cases, the labels didn't have a logo. They would just have the name of a company And in some cases, it wasn't Libby's. So I know that they did what a lot of companies do. They would manufacture for another company's name. Some of these labels would say the Cress Company. I don't know who that is, but this one I thought was kind of interesting. It says Brookdale brand. I'm not familiar with that. It may be something from another country, since these were exported all over the world. So it might be recognized in another country or up in Canada. The label that we're printing today was meant for export up to Canada.
Amy has a question about the uppercase and lowercase story.
Okay.
She wants to know if that is really true, because she just heard it was a cool story and she wasn't sure if that was 100% accurate.
It is 100% accurate. So in the early days of printing, you can imagine for a moment that the tour I gave you in the front room, we talked a little bit about the handset type, and that was invented by Gutenberg in the middle of the 1400s. So you've got people standing at typecases literally from the 1450s right up until the 1860s, 1880s, in fact, I should say. So you've got hundreds of years of people setting type for all the books, all the magazines, all the newspapers. That means you need a lot of letters. So the typecase where the letters go, just the small letters, is big and is full of all those little letters. Capitals aren't used as often. So you've got the capital letters in a separate case, and they put that up above. And they had a name for them. They were capital letters. But the letters in the case below were just letters. So distinguishing between those two, you would say they are the letters in the lower case. Eventually, you would say lowercase letters. And the capitals would be uppercase letters.
Oh, it's so interesting. Thank you for clarifying all of that for us.
You know, it's funny. There are also a couple of other things that come from printing that you use every day that you don't think about, like the phrase "mind your P's and Q's." Right? So that's something that I had never really thought about until I started spending a lot of time here in the print shop. So mind your P's and Q's. When you're setting type, as Jim mentioned earlier, you've got uppercase, you've got, everything is backwards, right? So you get used to reading the type upside down and backwards. So when you're looking at things, you might think a P is a Q or a B is a D, or, you know, sort of all of these things that we say now, and this is where they're originating from. So the upper and lower case is just one example. But my favorite is the mind your P's and Q's. And that's something that we always like to bring out when we have people coming through the print shop and show them the example with the type.
Excellent.
Yeah.
It's a good thing to talk about. Any other questions that might be looming on our, and feel free, we've actually got a lot of time in our time slot here.
Well, I don't see any other questions coming through the queue quite yet, but I definitely will welcome them. But I am curious if, oh, I have another one. Amy wants to know if you could explain what a printer's devil is.
Oh.
Yeah, sure. Jim, I'm going to turn that over to you.
Okay. So if you were to be working in a print shop and you wanted to be putting type together, you had people who were very skilled at what they were doing, and they were setting type and all that stuff, and you didn't want them spending their time with, say, the lesser tasks, cleaning things up, putting type away, sorting out things that needed to be distributed. So they would generally hire a young boy to come and work in the shop. Now, printing has a lot of roots in religion. So there's, are we offline? Okay. We're okay, okay. We had a little technical glitch, but it looks like we're okay. So there are things that happen in print shops that relate to religion. Well, having this person who's doing this menial task involves things like cleaning out what we call the hell box. And that's where type goes. It gets damaged or scraps from cutting off the spacing material. We put it in the hell box. It goes to hell. It sits on the floor. Well, that might be something that this apprentice or this starting person would be asked to work on. So who works on things that are in the hell box? Well, that would be the devil. And so they got nicknamed the printer's devil.
Fascinating.
Okay.
And what about the ink that you just made right now, or the label that you just made right now? Pat wanted to know, how long would it take for that ink to dry?
So that's an excellent question, because today when things pop out of an inkjet printer or a laser printer, they are basically good to go. They are dry that instant. But real oil-based printing ink printed on paper like we just did here moments ago, this could stay wet for hours. You could imagine this in the wintertime taking 2 or 3 hours to dry. In a summertime, hot day, if it's 100 degrees, it might take 20 minutes to dry. So certainly printing like this will smudge for quite a while. It will start to dry on the surface kind of like paint would, but it would still be a little soft underneath. So when printers print, the way that Katie has stacked this here randomly like this is typically how they do it on purpose. Because if you were to position the paper one directly over the top of the other, there is a little bit of flatness to the paper where we pushed on it, and that would align with the ink surface below. Ink might transfer onto the back of the preceding print. So that is referred to, by the way, as set off. In the early days, it was called offset, but of course now we have offset printing. So they would call that set off, and you didn't like it because you might be printing on the back side of this later, and it would be little speckles of ink, and it would be, well, detracting from the quality. So there was another thing they did when they got into production printing to prevent that, and that was to dust the printing with anti-offset powder, later called anti-set-off powder. It's basically like very fine cornstarch. And they would sprinkle that on the printing as it was happening to mechanically keep the print separate. And that would keep it from smearing. It would just stack until it was dry.
Yeah, and there's actually different kinds of ink. People primarily use oil-based ink or rubber-based ink. So in the shop, we mainly always use oil-based ink, right, Jim?
Mm-hmm.
But the way that they dry is different, and the way that they behave on your press can be a little bit different too. So yeah, so with rubber-based ink, how does that work? I mean, I know that it dries differently. Does it take longer? Does it take...
So how does that happen?
Yeah, tell us about it.
Tell us about inks. So oil-based inks, they start way back in Gutenberg's day. In fact, what Gutenberg did, he had a lot of problems to solve as an engineer, effectively inventing how all the things work in printing. He combined linseed oil and lamp black. That's soot. So you take soot from a fireplace, you take linseed oil, and you make a paste out of that. It works surprisingly well, but it takes a long time for linseed oil to dry. It dries primarily through absorbing into the paper fibers and a little bit of evaporation, or a balance between those two, let's say. Now, fast forward to, I want to say the 1960s, they invent rubber-based ink. It's still technically got oil in it, but they've added a rubber component. How, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know whether they grind up car tires or they use whatever they make car tires out of, but it smells a little bit like tires, so I know there's some rubber in there somewhere. But rubber-based ink behaves completely differently from this oil-based ink. When you put oil-based ink on a printing press like we've done here, after we're finished with this today, I have to clean that off right away, because much like paint, it will dry on this press. It will become hard, just like paint, and it will be very difficult to clean off. Rubber-based ink, on the other hand, it stays open on the press. Open is a printer term for wet. It doesn't dry on the machinery because it's formulated to absorb into the fibers of the paper, and that's when it dries. And it dries very quickly, depending on the paper stock. Some paper stocks, that kind of ink, the rubber-based ink, will dry seemingly instantaneously. Oil-based ink, for the most part, whatever the stock is, it's going to stay wet for a long time on the stock. Rubber-based right away.
That's fascinating. That brings us to Amy's other question, which is your own hands. What would you use to clean the ink in your hands?
To clean the ink off of my hands, well, we don't have running water here in the shop, so we actually use little hand wipes. Printers in the day would use hand cleaner, much like mechanics do. They would use some harsh soap to clean off if they got ink on their hands. What we do today also is we have nitrile gloves, which I will put on before I clean the press, because we clean it with solvent like kerosene or mineral spirits to clean it off. Some printers use mineral oil, and just mix that into the ink, which makes it very runny, and then they'll wipe that up. But yeah, we'll use hand cleaner.
I find baby wipes are really effective, actually. Just like standard wet wipes are great if you just get a little bit of ink on your hands. If you've been cleaning your press and your hands are really filthy, there's a product called Go Gel. Isn't that what it is? Yeah, and it's you can buy it like at a hardware store, and it's sort of scrubby. And the key to this is rub it onto your dry hands, and then it will get the ink off, and then wash your hands afterwards. If you get your hands wet and then try to use the Go Gel on your hands, it does not work. It is not as effective. But I think inevitably if you're printing a lot, you're going to end up with a little bit of ink under your nails, that sort of thing. But yeah, baby wipes are a great thing to have in your shop.
I have another question about presses themselves. Lorraine wants to know, would any of these presses be used for newspaper printing, or would that have to be a special press?
That's a good question.
I'll take that one. So a lot of visitors who come in the print shop in the past would come in and tell their children that this is where they printed newspapers. And we have to kind of politely correct them and say, not so much. These presses were job presses. And job work is what you do today when you go to a local copy place, one of those like a FedEx place or whatever, and they will do copies for you. Or one of the small town shops that still exists where you can get wedding invitations printed or tickets or that kind of work. So this is really small things. The big 10 by 15 press, it could be used to do a small book, or it could be used to do a flyer or a handbill. But when somebody says newspaper, this is a different path that printing took. The presses that were used in Gutenberg's day, we had a big bed, you put the type in the bed, you put the paper in and you pull a big handle. Those presses got larger and larger. In some cases, you had to pull the handle twice to get the big surface area. And where I say that the printing diverged from job printing like this and newspapers was those presses got larger to the point where there were cylinders that would rotate. The bed would move back and forth. In fact, the proof presses we have in this shop are very similar, just scaled down a little bit. If you look at this press here, the type would sit in the bed of the press. This is a proof press, so I can show it manually. They would ink it with an ink roller and put the paper in and then roll it through. And that would be how you could do a proof. That's also how we do our poster printing. Imagine a press like this, but make it much, much, much larger. Make this cylinder 5 times as big and have the bed of the press have your newspaper page type standing in it. People would stand and feed paper onto the cylinder and it would roll through. So newspaper printing has its own path. They're still using the handset type and then eventually changing to linotype. They are using presses like this with the same kinds of ink, although they put a lot of oil in the ink because they're printing on newsprint and it never dries. That's why you get ink on your fingers from newsprint newspapers. Eventually the newspapers stop setting their type by hand and they go with the linotype. There's one newspaper left in the United States that's still setting from a linotype machine, and they're printing directly from those linotype slugs. I'd love to tell you the name of it, but I've forgotten. But it's easily found online.
Well, speaking of innovations, did any printers in the Valley make any printing innovations?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because we had on display at one time one of our printers in our Printers Guild. He uses printing presses to do a little bit different work, and that was what's called die cutting. So instead of putting type in the bed of the press, they put in a die that's basically a knife blade that's the same height as type, and they press that through the paper, and it cuts the paper instead of printing on it. And you see die cutting all the time. The most common one you see every day is when you come home and something's hanging on the doorknob, and someone has left one of those flyers, and it's got a circle cut out with a score or a cut, and it slips over the doorknob. You see them in hotels, the do not disturb sign that hangs on there. Well, our printer friend, John Edgerton, he is the J in T&J die cutting and printing. And back in the early days of Silicon Valley when they were making floppy disks, remember the floppy disk? They first started out great big and then they got a little smaller. There were 8-inch floppies and then there were 5 1/4 floppies. Well, his company was contracted to use these old printing presses and die cut the little disks that go in those floppy disks, and then the actual housing for the floppy disk itself, which would be folded up and crimped together at the factory. In their peak of production, and they were running, I think, at least 2, maybe 3 shifts at one point making those on presses just like this Liberty press. People were hand feeding in the material to make the disks and the covers for them. They were making 64,000 floppy disks a day at the peak of their production. So quite the innovation to change from being just letterpress, where you can print, or just plain die cutting, which you might see in things that hang on a doorknob or box cutting. This just in, I've been handed, this is a die for making the hanger for a doorknob. I'm showing you the back of it so you can see the shiny metal, and you'll see that there's a little guy that sticks out here, and there's some options on this one. You can make it go straight down or to the side. And on the other side, you'll see what looks like black foam here. It's sort of like wetsuit material. And what that does for you is pushes the paper back off the knife blades. So when this is in the press and it pushes into the paper, the knife blades will go through and cut the paper. And then when it comes back out, the foam will push the paper off the knife blade. On the other side of the press, there's usually a metal plate that this pushes into to make a clean cut.
Wow, that's really cool. Thank you so much for showing us.
All right, more questions. We still have 10 minutes.
So do you use 3D color printing or a color for each shade?
So 2 questions there. You just said 3D color printing?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, no, 3 color printing. Sorry.
3 color printing. Oh, absolutely.
Never mind. That's all one question. I misread that. So do you use 3 color printing, or do you have to use it each shade when you're printing in various colors?
Okay. So when we print in colors, there would be separate press runs for each color. And some of the posters that are in here, in fact, if we could turn the camera around, and I will talk really loudly so you can hear me, and I will come down to the end so the microphone will be pointing at me. Some of these posters that you see on the wall are in more than one color. For example, this one over here, if we can take a look at Eats, Shoots, and Leaves. This one was run in 2 colors in one form on the press. And if you take a look down here, you'll notice there's a little bit of blue ink on top of the word leaves. This one was printed in the press all at once by using 2 separate ink rollers, one with the red ink and one with the blue. And you very carefully ink each one, and then you can print it in one pass through the press. And that's how we got this. But typically in production printing, you'll run the paper through the press with one color, take that form out of the press, clean off all the ink, put in a second color, and run it all again. Now, if that's done in enough passes and it's done precisely enough, you can get something that looks like this. This is 4 passes through the press, each pass a different color, C, M, Y, K, C for cyan, M for magenta, Y for yellow, and K actually stands for key, but the key is typically printed in black. This is a CMYK print that I did years ago. I took a digital picture, and then I sent that digital picture off to Owasso, Michigan, to be turned into 4 separate copper printing plates. After the 4 printing plates were printed in sequence on here, so this piece of paper went through the press 5 times, along with a bunch of other pieces of paper. They all went through the press first on one color. Let's just say we did the yellow first. Then that's cleaned off, the plate is changed, and they're run through in exactly the same position for the red, and then the blue, and finally the black. And one more pass, the text on here was run separately in a 5th pass. It could have been run with the black of the picture. It's just a complication I didn't want to have to deal with. That's about as complicated as it gets with 4 color printing. Okay, terrific question. Do we have any more questions? Ooh, let's talk about that guy. This is a tramp printer. Back in the early days of printing, there were unions, and the journeyman in a union literally can journey. In fact, that's where journeyman comes from. the unions had a rule that said that if you're a journeyman and you traveled to another town and found a union shop, and that union shop had work available, they had to offer it to a traveling journeyman. The only problem with that was that those journeymen got paid ahead of the regular pay schedule. And what started out as a good idea, you ended up with a lot of these printers, some of them good, some of them not so good, but they would take the work to get some money, and then they would go find a nearby bar, and they would drink, and then they would not come back to work. So some of them were reliable, some of them not so much, and they got nicknamed tramp printers. In this illustration, we see one standing by the railroad tracks because a lot of them traveled in empty boxcars going from town to town, looking for work, hanging their union card, as they called it, and they would get summoned to do some typesetting or some printing. By the way, they weren't all bad. Some of them were excellent printers, and they were actually well respected. They would show up in a town and say, oh, great, so-and-so is here, let's put him to work and he can print for us. And they did.
So does that mean the people in town had the machine and these men just sort of roamed around?
Absolutely. So you would have a job shop, much like our own printing exhibit here, and this gentleman might show up at the door and say, I am a union printer, here's my union card, do you have work for me? And the foreman might say, or the owner of the shop say, yes, we're a union shop and we've got more than the work that our guys can do. Why don't you come around on Thursday and we'll put you to work. You can do some typesetting for us.
That's fascinating. Katrina is quite astute and found out that you had the words Wayzgoose and dingbats. So just curious if you could tell us a little bit more about these words.
All right. Okay, so we have our annual printers fair and we also throw in that word, Wayzgoose. So it's a word of much controversy, but the easy story is that there was a point in printing when you were typesetting by daylight, and at the winter solstice, I think it changes, so you end up where it gets dark and you have to start setting by candlelight. And the owners of these printing establishments would throw a party. And some people say that at that party they served goose, and that's where we get the goose in Wayzgoose. Others say that the name for that was a Dutch word which got mispronounced in English and sounded like Wayzgoose. So either way you go, there's still a party, and they were celebrating the end of printing or typesetting with the daylight. Today, it's more about printers getting together and showing how they print and showing off their shops, and for the public to come at our printers fair and we get to entertain them with our typesetting and printing. And in some cases, they get to do their typesetting and we show them their own typesetting and printing. Hopefully.
What about dingbats?
Dingbats, dingbats is a common word that we use to describe the ornaments that are used in printing. So when you put some little doodad, there's lots of names for them. The type manufacturers refer to them as ornaments, but printers call them dingbats. I'm sure there's some etymology to the word, but I don't know what it is. So yeah, those are the ornaments that are used in printing that are not necessarily a letter or a number or some kind of punctuation, but more stylish or decorative. And they just get lumped into a category as dingbat. One of our Printers Guild members, Dave Tribby, the one that runs the website that includes Liberty Presses, he did a survey of printers and asked them to identify what they thought were dingbats and what weren't. And there was no consensus. So it was all over the place. Good question, though. Okay. Are there any other questions?
I think we're good for now. Thank you so much for opening up the print shop for us today. If someone wanted to become a printer and join the Printers Guild, how would they go about doing that?
Well, first off, contact us and let us know who you are. You can certainly email me directly, or you could contact the museum. But when we're back to post-pandemic, we're going to be meeting here like we usually do on the second Saturday of each month here on the museum grounds. We can get you on our mailing list to let you know when we're going to be meeting. And, you know, you can come down with no experience and learn what it's all about. See what we do in our shop and at our meetings. Come to one of our printers fair and see what printing is like firsthand. Maybe take the handle of one of our proof presses and make a print. You could also try your hand at typesetting like you saw Katie do.
Yeah, and you can also check us out on social media. We're on Instagram at SJ Printers Guild, and we're also on Facebook under SJ Printers Guild. So please follow us on social media. There's a link to our website there. We have a lot of information, and we'll let you know what's happening with the Guild. And, we can't wait to be back in the shop and having events again and interacting with the public. So it's been great to be able to see some of you virtually today. It'll be even better to be able to see people in person again.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for opening the shop virtually today. I hope you all have a good rest of your day, and you're getting a round of applause or virtual rounds of applause, just so y'all know. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.